All right, I think we can get going. Thank you everyone for coming to our Art Bites today. We continue our coverage of Grant Wood, inspired by our three wonderful exhibitions that we have on at the museum now. I do anticipate that sometime in the next couple of months, we'll be going back to in-person programming, which is very exciting and fantastic. But for now, I will continue with our Zoom series. So can everyone hear me? All right, I'm going with Paul because he's the only face I can see. So Paul, you're my canary in the coal mine. So today we are going to be talking about kind of the history of reception of Grant Wood's art. Oop, not you, go back. All right. So Wood's early paintings, as we see here, mainly landscapes, architectural views, thick brush, impressionistic style. Of course, in 1928, we know he travels to Munich to supervise production of a stained glass window that he designed for the Vets Memorial Building. This he did with the Emil Frey Stained Glass Company. They have an office in St. Louis, but this was such a scale that the St. Louis branch couldn't do it, and so he travels to Munich. So it's in Munich where he first visits the Alte Pinakothek, which is the old picture gallery, where he sees 15th century Netherlandish painters like Hans Memling, Roger van de Weyden, Jan van Eyck. And this coincides with the dramatic change in his artistic style that starts in 1928. So he starts to paint Midwestern themes using a stylized aesthetic that we see here, hard edges, strong colors, very clearly drawn from these Northern Renaissance masters. Excuse me. He's also attracted to the hard edge attention to detail of the Netherlandish style, which we see particularly in Hans Memling's work. And so these visual qualities coincide with his interest in Currier and Ives prints, as we see here, American folk art, and the decorative traditions of 19th century Americana. So Wood became convinced that there was a distinctly American quality to smooth paint handling, as evidenced here in this work by John Singleton Copley. This is from the 18th century, one of my favorite Copley works. And you'll note that this style is quite similar to what we saw from those Northern Renaissance masters. So Wood's first Netherlandish-inspired canvas comes from 1929. This is, of course, our lovely Woman with Plants, portraying his mother Hattie in country garb. She's got her apron trimmed in rickrack, her cameo brooch with Persephone on it. She's got the snake plant, also called mother-in-law's tongue. The composition derives from Renaissance portraiture. We've got her half-length figure close to the picture plane, juxtaposed against a distant landscape. But the windmill and shocks of corn that we see here over Hattie's shoulder localize the painting to the American Midwest. So although Wood himself credited his trip to Munich as the catalyst for his conversion to his mature style of regionalism, there are other more immediate sources for his turn to Midwestern themes, including his admiration for the writings of J. Sigmund and Ruth Suckow, both of Iowa. And they both encouraged Midwesterners to cherish their indigenous heritage and eschew the prevalent inferiority complex that Midwesterners had regarding East Coast and European culture. So Woman with Plants specifically seems to be a translation into paint of the protagonist pioneer woman in Ruth Suckow's short story Midwestern Primitive, which published in Harper's Magazine in 1829. So of course, Wood attains national stature in 1930 with American Gothic. Of course, this won a medal in the 1930 show at the Art Institute. And following that success, Wood turned to images of people, life, and landscape of the American heartland. He also illustrated archetypal episodes in American history, such as the Midnight Ride of Paul Revere, Parson Weems' Fable. And you'll note all of these works are painted in his distinctive mature style. In 1932, he co-founds the Stone City Art Colony, an art school in rural Iowa. This was short-lived, but a lovely community for Midwestern artists. And in 1934, he became director of the New Deal Art Public Works Art Project in Iowa. Later that year, he started teaching at the university. In the midst of controversy over Wood's position at the university, where the art department was moving more decisively towards modernism, Wood died of pancreatic cancer on February 12, 1942. So this is just a very, very brief biography, which from your names, I know we're all largely familiar with. So what I really wanted to talk about today is kind of the history of reception of Wood's art. So what people thought about his work just prior to and after his death, and kind of how art historically he's found himself in the place that he is now. So as I said, Wood attained national stature in 1930 with the painting American Gothic. Then he turns to these archetypal works of the American Heartland. So he's best known for the paintings and lithographs produced in this mature style that we see in the 30s and 40s. So again, hard-edged detail, geometricized forms, stylized contours, often tinged with myth and wit. These are, of course, his last two paintings here. Spring in the Country on the left, which we own at the CRMA, and Spring in Town, which is the property of the Swope. Won't get to that quite yet. So in the 30s and 40s, Wood enjoyed broad popularity, especially from 1930 to 1935. But by the late 1930s, as international political concerns started to overshadow domestic ones, regionalist art, like Wood's, was coming under attack for its parochialism, its Midwestern chauvinism, its narrative style, and its patent refusal to keep pace with the new emerging American abstract art that really dominated the post-war years in this country. So Horst W. Jansen, a very, very large art historical name, especially in the Midwest. So he wrote a 1946 article called Benton and Wood, Champions of Regionalism. And in this article, he decried regionalist art as being on par with the fascist art of Mussolini's Italy and Hitler's Germany. Here I have a couple examples of didactic art from Hitler's Germany. This is the Judgment of Paris, and Paris is here depicted as a Hitler youth and judging pure-blooded Aryan women. I once wrote a paper on Nazi propaganda art, which I'm sure got me on several watch lists because I had to order the art catalogs from 1937 and 1938 shows of propaganda art. So I think it's gonna be a long time before that's scrubbed from my record. And so this is what Jansen was really comparing Wood's art to. And you can see there are stylistically a lot of similarities. Again, we have a lot of hard edge style, but more importantly, Jansen is seeing this fascist art. It's easy to read. This is the main issue with propaganda art, is that it's easy to understand. You don't need to have an art historical background to get it. It's didactic, it's teaching a lesson, it's all narrative, and it's pretty simplistic. So these are the parallels that Jansen is drawing between the art of these fascist regimes and what he's seeing in regionalist art. So Jansen's article is published 4 years after Grant Wood's death. And this kind of sums up what most of the art world thought about his art and the regionalists generally, until it was rediscovered in the 1970s by scholars like Carol Ann Marling, and later by Wanda Korn, her book seen here, and James Dennis. So Wanda Korn's 1983 exhibition, Grant Wood, the Regionalist Vision, and the accompanying publication seen here, that did a lot to reignite interest in the 1930s art, which was a decade that many saw as the government keeping more modern abstract aesthetics in the wings while they encouraged representational, nostalgic Americana. The fact that the Whitney just did another Grant Wood exhibition in 2018, it was, rediscovering Grant Wood, I suppose. And that's kind of proof that regionalism's reputation as pedantic at best and fascist at worst still kind of simmers in the wings. So in the 1920s, America was really looking for a distinctly American art. So in the 1920s, we still have a lot of insecurity in the American art world, that American artists aren't as good as European artists. They're not as unique. We don't have a national style in the way that Impressionism was French, or Romanticism was largely German. So there's a lot of insecurity, but we don't have an American art style. So we were looking for all sorts of ideas. We see a lot of European-inspired modernism, African-American spiritual-inspired art. With the stock crash and the onset of the Great Depression in 29, of course, things change. The American scene movement, which at its broadest interpretation, encouraged artists to paint what they knew from their own worlds. And so in that broad interpretation, we could say, as I go back for a moment, that the American scene movement includes artists like Archibald Motley and Jacob Lawrence, alongside Edward Hopper and Charles Sheeler. But with the crash in 1929 and the onset of the Great Depression, our idea of the American scene movement really starts to narrow. So we started searching for an art that was distinctly American, and we seemed to be settling on images of the rural Midwest. This is, of course, Grant Wood's Arbor Day right here. So in times of crisis, these images of a bucolic, pious world of fertile farmland and upstanding citizens really seemed to strike a chord with white America. So these were the American values that they wanted to propagate and remember in the tough times. There's no reference to exotic European modernism. There's no African masks. There's no wild views of city life. And in large part, this regionalist vision was delivered by three men, who I'm sure we're all familiar with, seen here: Benton, Wood, and Curry. And so these gentlemen from Iowa, Missouri, and Kansas, respectively. Regionalism was largely sparked by Grant Wood after the great success of American Gothic at the Art Institute of Chicago. Wood convinced Benton and Curry to return from the cities where they were having their own bohemian periods and no doubt their own ill-advised facial hair, as his goatee had been judged. Wood was a really big believer in creating art from what you knew and the environment that you were born in. He even created, as I said, the short-lived Stone City Art Colony. And here we can see good examples of all three of their works. This is Wood's Fall Plowing from 1931, Thomas Hart Benton's Social History of the State of Missouri from 36, and Curry's Baptism in Kansas from 28. So these are all evoking mythologized views of this good, stalwart Midwest that constituted the heart of America. Most of these works, as I said, were created during the Great Depression, but there is rarely any hint of trouble in regionalist paintings. The only challenges seem to come from nature. There are thunderstorms, snow, tornadoes, and all are met with the hard work of the American man. One of Curry's most famous paintings, John Brown from 1939, uses a tornado as a metaphor for the turmoil the country was in during when the abolitionist was preaching against extending slavery into Kansas territory. So this bucolic regionalist vision of the Midwest juxtaposes really dramatically with works like Alexander Hoag's. On the left, we have Erosion's number 2, Mother Earth Laid Bare from 1938, or on the right, Drought-Stricken Area from 1934. There's no sign in most regionalist works that the Dust Bowl is taking place or that people are losing their farms. Instead, we see images like Wood's Spring in the Country or Benton's July Hay, so fertile, prosperous farmland that is being worked in distinctly old-fashioned ways by hand and horse-drawn plow. So even if, now we think of the early 20th century as the good old days, even in the early 20th century, they were yearning for the good old days as well. So one of the biggest patrons of regionalist art was, of course, the US government. There were several variations of the organizations responsible for art during the Great Depression. Under the umbrella of the Works Progress Administration, which worked from 1935 to 1943, there was the Federal Art Project and then the Treasury Relief Art Project, which replaced the Public Works of Art Project, all of which supplied artists with jobs and decorated government buildings, both old and new. As Harry Hopkins said to those who criticized the government for funding artists, hell, they've got to eat just like the rest of us. Grant Wood was the head of the PWAP for Iowa and oversaw projects during that short-lived 33-34. And this included murals for the Agricultural Science Library at ISU in 34. We, of course, have the study for this painting in our collection. Benton and Curry also created murals for government buildings. Benton's previously mentioned Social History of Missouri, and Curry's Oklahoma Land Rush that we see here on the right from 38. Both celebrating American history and, in Benton's case, with a hearty side of socialism. So these government programs only had a few requirements for the artwork. The scenes were American and the style had to be representational. So although Benton, Wood, and Curry all have unique aesthetics, you would never confuse a Benton work for a Wood or a Curry for a Benton. So they do all have distinct styles, but they are all deeply representational. And this is opposed to the more abstracted modern works of the 1920s that required more knowledge and sophistication on the art of the viewer to appreciate. As suited art forms seen on the walls of public buildings, regionalist works were immediately legible to the common man. And this is partly what Jansen and others of his ilk disliked about them, as legibility was one of the main desires of the art of fascist dictators, as I discussed before. So those who disliked regionalism found it really provincial and proof that America's moving backwards as opposed to forwards in art. So basically, like, Americans are still reading the artistic equivalent of picture books when they should be reading novels. Whether the author is discussing how Benton's political views are present in his murals or the possible homosexuality of Grant Wood, who we'll get to in a minute, regionalism is no longer written off as quasi-fascist illustration. It is tainted for a couple of decades mid-century. Notably, if you have one of Jansen's history of art books from any time between when he initially wrote it and 1970s or 1980s, you will see that regionalism is nowhere to be found. Regionalism did revive itself in the late 70s into early 80s and has been found worthy of serious artistic scholarship. And so in my little final section, I'm going to discuss kind of where current scholarship is on Grant Wood. And for this, I'd like to give special thanks to the art historian and scholar Richard Meyer from Stanford. He wrote one of the essays in the Whitney's catalog in their Wood exhibition, and he and I corresponded a little bit about Wood scholarship after that. So in the past, I'm going to say decade, interest in Grant Wood's sexuality has increasingly been brought to the fore of his scholarship. There's a great preponderance of evidence to suggest that Wood's personality and sexuality differed greatly from the hardy masculinity that was encouraged for men during the early 20th century. Of course, we start the 20th century with men like Teddy Roosevelt with their bare knuckles boxing, and they're bemoaning about the fact that, you know, there's no frontier anymore and men are going to be feminized. There was a lot of panic about American masculinity in the early 20th century. And so Wood's fellow regionalists like Benton was very machismo, and he really went for this full-throated masculine personality. Benton especially railed against the precious fairies, quote unquote, who presided over the New York art world. His screed was echoed into the writings of his closest ally, the anti-modernist critic Thomas Craven. And according to Craven, there was a modern cult of effeminacy that was threatening to sap the manly vigor of American art. Craven lamented the displacement of the traditional role of the artist as an honest and sober workman by that of a, quote, shiftless epicene pretending to or actually possessing abnormal sensitivity, end quote. So Grant Wood, of course, get to that, was neither a precious fairy in Manhattan nor a man's man in the mold of Benton. As an artist who repudiated modernist art theory in favor of Midwestern themes and agrarian realism, Wood was hardly embraced by Benton and Craven. Yet his fellow regionalists did recognize that Wood's masculinity was not what they would consider normative. In 1930, the year, of course, that American Gothic was painted, Wood was described by the Des Moines Tribune-Capital thusly, quote, Grant Wood is a bachelor and lives with a quiet, sweet-faced woman who is his mother. Pink of face and plump of figure, Iowa's most famous artist calls forth the mental adjective cherubic, seraphic, and all the rest. Perhaps he was most nearly in character one night when he appeared at a costume party dressed as an angel. Wings, pink flannel nightie, pink toes, and even a halo supported by a stick thrusting up from his back. And we have a lovely portrait here, Grant Wood as cute as an angel, is in the red circle here, and we can see his Cupid. He's got the bow. I can't quite see the halo, but his pink flannel nightie is in evidence. While Time ran a story on American art in December of 1934, it crowned Benton, quote, the most virile of U.S. painters on the U.S. scene. We see Benton on the cover on the left here, while describing Wood as a shy bachelor who was both, quote, chubby and soft-spoken. To be a shy bachelor, as I drop my notes, to be a shy bachelor at the age of 45, which is the age Wood was at the time of the article, was not the same thing as being called a homosexual, but it did signal a departure from convention linked, however tacitly, to the possibility of other forms of social and sexual difference. So I'm sure you're all familiar with Trip Evans's Grant Wood: A Life, published in 2010. And so this book has really shaped Grant Wood scholarship in the past 10 years. In it, Evans discusses Wood's career largely in light of his quote, homosexuality and how his studied masculinity was a ruse that shaped his work. Evans's book is the most sustained and serious book-length biography of Wood to date and relies heavily on psychosexual readings of the artist's life and work. In some cases, as in the author's account of Wood's ill-fated, short-lived marriage to Sarah Maxon as a cover or beard for his homosexuality, these accounts are subtle and convincing. However, this is one of the first books I read when I joined the CRMA, just to really get my feet wet with Grant Wood's scholarship. It's my personal opinion that Evans's projection of sexual imagery onto Wood's art don't really hold up. So if you're familiar with the book, most of Evans's discussion of Wood's art is undated with what I would consider to be somewhat obsessive searching for homosexual imagery. So in things like Spring Turning from 1936, Evans describes the rolling hills of the Iowa landscape as Wood's evocation of muscular male buttocks and upper thighs, which he believed the artist isolated and monumentalized. Or, if you're familiar with Eastern Iowa, it looks like the hills of Eastern Iowa. So to sum up, gay erasure is a very real and awful thing, and the desire to bring Wood out of the art historical closet is both understandable and commendable, especially considering the decades of silence on the subject. But in doing so, however, we need to remember that homosexuality in the 1930s, whether Wood's or anyone else's, can't really be understood in the coherent, confident terms of gay identity as we would understand it today. And any attempt, I think, to group all of Wood's prodigious output under the umbrella of gay art seems ludicrous at best and actively harmful and bad art history at the worst. No one, of course, is solely their sexual orientation, and we don't understand all of a straight artist's work as relating to their sexuality. So nor should we be seeing Wood solely through this lens. And thus ends my presentation. I would love to answer any questions that anyone has.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah, of course.
In the photograph that you had showing Benton, Curry, and Wood standing in someone's home, I assume. I'm assuming it was Grant Wood's home, but I don't know. There was a painting right behind them. Do you happen to know what that was?
Let me take a look.
I'm just curious. Right.
It's a Benton, but I'm not sure which one it is.
Okay.
I mean, it looks like a Madonna and Child. So I would guess that would be the title, but it's definitely Benton.
Okay. I was just curious. Does anyone have information about just a side note, what art Grant Wood did have in his home or his studio? Was it his own? Was it that of friends? Any thoughts on that?
I am unknown. Oh, who has Jim Hayes actually would probably be a really good person to talk to about that, since he has the Grant Wood House in Iowa City. And I know he published a book on it several years ago, but I bet he would, if not have an inventory, then be able to steer you in the right direction for it.
And one last question, kind of an idle question. Early in your talk, you mentioned that Grant Wood was influenced by 2 Iowa authors, and you said the names, but I didn't catch. What are those names?
Oh, sure. It's J. Sigmund and Ruth Suckow.
Thank you.
Yeah, my pleasure. All right. Well, if there are no further questions, it's been lovely talking to everyone today, and I look forward to seeing everyone hopefully in person when we do this at the museum again soon.